Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Arnott. I'm from the University of Ottawa, and me and my colleague Micah Vernica from the University of British Columbia are the facilitators of these really interesting and fun French second language research exchanges. So my job today is to talk about what we mean by exchange, just to make sure that those sort of housekeeping and expectations are laid out. Talk briefly, super briefly, in a couple sentences of what this gap we're talking about is, and then Callie and I have spoken, and I'm going to give a brief introduction similar to Kim's, and then I'll allow Callie to introduce herself, because I think I don't want to say something strong like positioning, but I think it's a good thing to start out with about where you're coming from with your thoughts and reflections on this particular gap. I think it's a tough one, but one we felt strongly about highlighting, because from the data from that CASLT FSL Teacher Education Report, it was very evident that this was a burning issue and gap in FSL Teacher Ed. So what do we mean by exchange? Really, what we mean is talking about listening and thinking together while also pushing our thinking. So there's no expectation of an outcome per se, but we're looking at pushing our thinking, our questions. It's a chance for you to voice a question that you've been thinking about yourself for a long time, perhaps in reaction to reading the report or doing your own research related to this particular theme. And then maybe even after having listened to the exchange between Micah, in this case, and Callie, after having listened to the exchange with the featured speaker. So part one, we're going to reserve the first block of time, almost half of the time, for us to exchange with Callie and hear her thoughts. And then in this case, we encourage you to listen. We welcome questions for the featured speaker in the chat. Raised hands won't really be responded to too much at this point, just to sort of give that space for reflection, contemplation, and sharing. However, part two is where we open it up halfway to questions and commentary, and to bring into the exchange bring you into the exchange, essentially, particularly related to questions we want to ask as researchers and as teachers and practitioners and so on. The gap itself for today is time and access. So in the FSL teacher education study, calls were made by all participants, so school district reps, faculty of education reps, and teachers themselves, for more. So as you hopefully saw in the report itself, there were lots of quotes to this effect. There were calls for more access to FSL-oriented professional development, preparation, and so on, which focuses both on language and pedagogical knowledge, and then also more time and support required. So we can't create more time, and we talked about that before, but of course this idea of what we prioritize with the time we have. But that time and support required to develop, organize, run, and attend such offerings that are existing or new ones that would meet the demand out there. So on that note, I will segue to and hand it over to Callie and Micah, but not without mentioning that in the introduction of Callie, I've been fortunate enough to work with Callie as a PhD student, as a new professor. I consider her to be a dear colleague and friend. I also love the idea of her commenting on this, on you commenting on this, Callie, because you have such a breadth of experience and a breadth of diverse experience as a teacher, as a parent, as a teacher educator, as a admin in a faculty of education, and as a learner yourself. I mean, I might be missing one, key word related to your profile, but I think you have a lot of background to bring to these questions that and to push our thinking on this particular gap, and of course FSL generally. So merci d'être venu, and I will hand it over to Micah and Callie.
Callie, did you want to introduce yourself? Yes, we'll go with that first.
Sure. First of all, let me say Happy New Year to everybody. As a new term starts, I'm sure you have a lot on your plates, as we're talking about time today. So I appreciate you making time to contribute to the conversation. I work in North Bay, Ontario at Nipissing University, which is situated on the territory of the Anishinaabe, according to the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And I acknowledge that I'm lucky and privileged to do so. So congratulations to the team for this pan-Canadian work, its contribution to research, but also, as I love, with practical implications that are making an impact on the on the field. So appreciate everybody taking time to reflect and engage and be part of this community. Je vais me présenter selon mes rôles et de cette façon, vous aurez aussi une idée de mes penchants, je dirais. Alors, comme Stéphanie a dit, je suis enseignante. J'ai enseigné pendant 16 ans ici en Ontario. J'ai enseigné au niveau secondaire et élémentaire au programme cadre ou français de base, immersion enrichie pour le programme du baccalauréat international. Mais comme vous pouvez entendre, je suis aussi apprenante de la langue et à mon âge, vous pouvez croire, j'ai commencé à étudier le français en 7e année en français cadre. Alors, on n'offrait pas le français cadre avant la 7e année à cette époque-là. Donc, j'ai toujours dû faire des choix pour maintenir, améliorer mes propres habiletés en suivant des cours aux universités ou en choisissant que j'aimais bien aller à Trois-Pistoles, par exemple, pour une semaine d'immersion. En même temps, c'est vraiment un privilège personnel d'être capable d'avoir ces expériences. So now I'm a professor at an English medium institution. We are a small institution. We're only 5,000. Probably at least 20% are Bachelor of Education students. To relate it to the report, we don't have a proficiency test for entry. We have a portfolio assignment as part of a course, and we do have optional opportunities. But as I'll share later, sometimes with very little take-up. As a researcher, all of my research has been in FSL in varying areas, but when working alone or with my cherished colleagues, if I have a choice, I choose to explore English language learners learning French and students with learning difficulties. So again, you'll note that there are similarities to the report in terms of questions of access and support. I wasn't going to introduce myself as a parent, but since Stephanie mentioned it, I am a parent of now 2 adult children. I do have an article based on my son's experience in French immersion and his withdrawal from French immersion that was a difficult one to write, but is connected to my research.
Thank you so much, Callie. You've had some really important aspects of the far-reaching assumptions, or I guess ideas attached to this idea of access. We talked a lot about this word and what it means. Before I put this question to you, I just wanted to read actually the 3 quotes that we include in the report, just to really hear, maybe start with the voices of our participants. The first one is, "Being a French teacher is my only access to the language." And this is a teacher from Central Canada. We have another one from the Eastern provinces. "Quelques enseignants ont besoin de perfectionner le français oral et écrit. Comment faire? Déjà, les enseignants sont surchargés." Donc, cette idée de le développement de ma langue continue, c'est toujours quelque chose que j'aimerais, que je dois faire. And it is difficult to find enough space in our programs to offer the courses in French that we need. So at another level that we see this idea of access as an important question. So comment est-ce que vous pensez, on peut se tutoyer en fait, comment est-ce que tu penses à cette lacune? Peut-être tu peux nous dire où en est ta réflexion en ce moment, en ce qui concerne
J'ai vraiment apprécié les recommandations. Alors, j'ai suivi la recommandation de réfléchir. And so the report encourages us all to reflect, and that's where I began. partially because in general, I follow rules and I like to think before I speak or act. And so it worked well for me. So a lot of my thought process comes from, I think it's page 29 of the report. I did some self-reflection on my present role, on the former roles that I mentioned, and I found that it shed light for me on aspects of the report. It allowed me to make connections for myself that I wouldn't have done had I not taken the time. So thanks for that professional encouragement that's in the document. And to the quotes, as a teacher, when I was reflecting on my journey, and I always went to a conference a year, and I was thinking, why did I do that? And I think, and remember, this is back in, I'm going to date myself, I think 1988. My professor encouraged us to do that and provided opportunities for us to do that. And so, although I might not have explicitly recognized that before, in my reflection, I do recognize him for the impact that had on me. And I sought it out that one year as I did my Bachelor of Education, and continued to do so, and was privileged to do so throughout my career. Less explainable is why I'm willing to take risks to put myself in situations to practice my French, or to improve my French, focus on my French. On one hand, it is an intrinsic motivation. It is an attitude. It is an understanding that it is a lifelong commitment I have made. And as an Anglophone living for the most part right now anyway, in North Bay, in an English-speaking community, although we have pockets of Francophones, it is a necessity for me to be an example for my students. But I have to admit that I was also encouraged extrinsically. So there were those carrots, you know, a raise in salary if you took so many courses, or things like that. So although some of the participants' experience was different than mine, or potentially because their experience was different than mine, led me to that thought. And I think potentially I underestimate my role as a BEd instructor, and although make connections with CASLT, and in our province, OMLTA, the Ontario Modern Language Teachers Association, with the teacher candidates, I think potentially it's not something that I emphasize enough. And I'm thinking about what's the best way for me to encourage teacher candidates to take up those professional learning opportunities, and could there be motivators attached? And then, because I did my teacher preparation so long ago, potentially that's part of the reason, but the participants' experiences are different than my own. And potentially for some of them, they have more challenges than I did. And as one participant said, there's very little left in the tank. So that led me to think about resiliency research. So I've often thought about that, and I've thought about, read the research of the power that we have as teachers to influence a student, the power one adult has to change a trajectory for one student. And then I'm thinking, well, we could use the same idea to build resiliency in FSL teachers. And my thought process was, I hesitated, because as I say that, and you may be thinking, that's putting the onus on the FSL teachers. Although I think to build resilience, although Michael Unger calls it to survive and thrive, or thrive and survive, probably survive and thrive, it takes systems to be able to do that well. So just want to highlight, I don't think the onus is on the teachers, but on systems. So people who are already resilient, seek opportunities, seek bonds with others, with our colleagues. And some of us have contexts where that is easier than others. So as someone who taught core French, I think about the effort it would take for me in that situation to create my social bonds. And so if I don't have such opportunities, I may not build the resilience, or I may go elsewhere to find the support I need if I can't find it in FSL. So I think building on social bonds, Richardson and McCabe, who are at Nipissing University, did research and found that it's not just the social bonds, but the participation, the social interaction, but high expectations in a community that prevent withdrawal. Communities of practice, when set up with the right resources, Michael Unger would say, he has a resiliency institute, would be supportive of teachers and contribute to their retention. And when he says they need the right resources, we need the right resources. The right resources, in my mind, when I'm reading this, is the supports that teachers need where they're at. And if they have those supports, they're more likely to seek opportunities for success, to feel motivated, more confident, more optimistic, and then seek out supportive opportunities for themselves. So the report, from a teacher perspective, led me to think about resiliency and also about communities of practice. And as a learner, similar to the participants, although a bit different, I've always sought opportunities, although insecure, to maintain my level of French. I don't remember any opportunities outside of the classroom offered in my B.Ed year. However, they could have been, and I was a 20-something commuter, and maybe I didn't take them up either. But also when I think about in high school, I went on exchange, and that shows me the importance of multiple systems working together. That exchange, although I didn't know it at the time, contributed to my attitude and my understanding that I needed to make a lifelong commitment, and learned what worked best for me in terms of finding an immersive environment, and then provided that to my students after.
It starts early. It's so interesting. You raise so many of the points that we saw speaking with the participants. And I just want to pick up a few of those. I mean, what you just said, the fact that it begins even before you ever get to that teacher education program. As a learner, I guess, of French, or a user of French, even in maybe even elementary, and then definitely secondary school. This notion of resilience is really, really interesting. You speak to this idea of taking the risk and seeking out these opportunities. And what we found, which was very interesting, there is, and we've been talking a lot about this over the years, is this idea of isolation. That's something that comes up as an important theme. And at the same time, we see kind of attached to that, this agency, I would call it, where when teachers are not finding opportunities, they're going out and seeking them, just like you did. They're finding them, but often they're sort of, they feel like they're doing it on their own. And this idea of setting high expectations, that is taking that onus off their shoulders a bit, because then, you know, how do we set those expectations? That's at a systemic level, that's at a higher level, where we create a culture, where we put in place supports, and we can then set those expectations. Which also makes me think of some of the work that's been done in retention and looking at attrition. And Kusi Aruba, for example, talked about this, and this is something that we've been seeing as well, where if there aren't these formal supports, the formal mentorship, we're seeing it being created amongst the teachers themselves, seeking out this critical friend, or on an informal level, I guess informal mentorship, and that itself needs defining to some extent. So it's really, really interesting. I want to come back though to this idea of what you said, that while the resilience is being built to some extent by the teachers themselves, and the things you mentioned, the things that are in our report, we've been talking about for many years. These are not necessarily new things. So this leads me to the next question of what's in the way? Where do we need to push? And so understanding, if we don't want to put it all on the shoulders of the teachers, how do we move beyond that? And I really I like this idea of resilience. I guess it's how do we build that?
I think the report gives us some great ideas. For example, money and finances can improve access. So, for example, in a community of practice, if teachers have a supply teacher, if they have release time, it not only gives them the time for those that are too busy, but it also shows that they are valued, and we recognize them, and we recognize their needs that may be different than others, and the support, which I think could enhance optimism and then resiliency. The report also mentions administration. So again, the administrators need to make a commitment to release those teachers when the day comes and, you know, they have 5 other teachers who are sick that day, the things that happen in their daily life. We hope that they would commit to still releasing the teachers regardless of what's happening the day of, and that they may need some learning in terms of the needs and advantages for FSL teachers, and ideally that they also learn about the content, because they're in a position where they could be very helpful if they also are aware of the content, because they could support the application of learning. I've been thinking, and this is a hard one, but I've been thinking, I don't think it was in the report, but I've been thinking about unions, associations, federations. You see me hesitating. I'm struggling. I know that they have funding. They could support professional learning. I think it would take some collective discussions to encourage them to do that. I don't think, at least in my limited experience, that they like to treat a group of teachers different than another group. So I think there is an opportunity. I think it would be a long-term goal, not something I've pursued yet, but like that we could have individual professional learning plans is something they may support if it's broadly applied. And I think when I think about it, what's in the way, I would say myself. I would say potentially we need to reflect. How am I in the way? As a second language learner, I need to push myself to engage. As a professor, I need to find resilience too. I need to find resilience to continue to offer optional opportunities when take up may be very little. And so that takes stamina. And so I would say not only others, but also, at least in my case, myself.
I think it's interesting. You mentioned the funding, and that makes me think of some of the things we heard from our district representatives as participants. We heard this, there's funding out there. We get the funding, we put it in place, we come up with these PD activities or these events, and no one shows up. And so I wonder to what extent, and then as you mentioned, we're finding teacher candidates can really use some gas money because they're driving kilometers to their schools, or they're so far away that even supporting them in terms of accommodation for those 10 weeks in that city where they're having to go. So those are the kinds of things that I'm not sure the people providing the funding are even thinking of. So there are needs, there are ideas about how that funding can be put in place. And I wonder to what extent we're not having that conversation. I think that's something that you just mentioned, to maybe sit down and I don't know, is that something that you've seen as well in where you've been operating in terms of the funding that's in place?
Right now, we have a combination of federal government and provincial government funding that is providing release for teachers to participate in communities of practice, which are have been very successful and offered in French. And for me, I think it's important, it's voluntary. So they get teacher release. So that helps. It doesn't solve because they still have to plan for the supply teacher, but it helps them be able to come to the day. And I hope there is a ripple effect. So now I'm also thinking about sustainability and how do we sustain that when the funding is sporadic. At least in my experience, it's sporadic and not necessarily long-term if you consider over years.
And so, I mean, it's interesting because to some extent we've been having out west here, we've been having these conversations with our ministry, and they are really pushing towards this moving longer than or beyond the 1-year contract. They're now actually exploring with the federal government for the next agreement, being able to extend these kinds of contracts or funding contracts for 2, 3, or 4 years. Because that's the kind of thing we need, that sustainability, right? We're not here just doing this job for a year. So I think we'll open it to moving to the next sort of Steph, did you want to jump in at this point?
Well, I mean, just for the next part, I think we sort of asked the questions about research, and Callie can answer that as sort of a springboard for others to participate. But one thing I did want to highlight is I really appreciated Callie's mentioning, and not vulnerability, but just this idea that, like, you know, I've got to do the work too. And it reminded me of our overarching spirit of writing the recommendations of not and the participants didn't necessarily do this, but I think there was a lot of uncertainty around what to do when it's so easy to point the finger at these people. If they did that, then things would be better. If they did that. So I think it's this lovely shared responsibility, which is kind of what we were trying to get at with the research generally, I think as well, is something, now that I've participated in this study and ongoing, I'm going to keep that in my head, that it's not just making a point that these people have to do this. I think you highlighted a few groups of stakeholders that we need involvement and, you know, engagement and discussions to know what's happening on their side of things, right? Not just a defensive oriented conversation. So I just wanted to mention that it was nice to hear that was kind of that the spirit of that part of the report came through in that way. So yeah, we want to start with Callie and the questions, Micah, and then we can open it up to the group. There's nothing in the chat so far, so I'm ready.
So moving to the final prompt, the question is, what questions should researchers be asking? I guess, so this is where we put on our researcher hats, as Steph just mentioned. Quelle question?
I'm laughing because I'm not so bold as to answer that question. I can share what I've been thinking and what I'm interested in, and I'm often pragmatic. And so I would think, and I hinted at it, so you may guess, I would like to figure out how we improve take-up. So for example, we mentioned, and the report mentions, a lack of optional informal opportunities. And when I've offered them, I don't have a lot of take-up. We've offered an additional course in French this year. We did not have a lot of take-up. So how how to improve take-up when opportunities are offered is something that I'd like to look at. I mentioned sustainability. If we have, for example, communities of practice and we work together across systems for months, how do we sustain that positivity? And I'm wondering if there's a ripple effect. So those people who didn't come, who were too uncomfortable to take the risk to be there, I'm wondering, is there a ripple effect? Will that go out? And if it were offered the following year, would having heard about it provide comfort that people who didn't come the first time might come the second time? And then, although my experiences with professional, I almost used that other word, with communities of practice, not to confuse people, I was thinking professional learning communities, but looking at different models and which models for professional learning works best for our teacher candidates, for our teachers. We have been trying to bring the groups together, and it's a struggle, just practically a struggle in terms of scheduling, but I'd like to make an effort to do that. Federations and associations also, I don't know about in your context, but in my context, of course, they have communities of teachers, but they also come in and speak to our teacher candidates. So they do have a reach that might be beneficial. And then I'm thinking, how do we continue the application? So if there's some accountability built into a community of practice, when that community of practice is over, how can we build in a continuity of application that would serve our learners, really? So I have lots of thoughts and not lots of answers.
No, those are yeah, no, I would totally agree with you. The take up is something that I also that has come up for me, and of course the sustainability. And I also like the fact you raise this idea of PD for teachers and for teacher candidates, and it may not necessarily be the same. One of the things that we're seeing with some of the things we offer, like our Institut de Français à Québec, you know, people who've gone, they want to go back. So once people have been, they do want to repeat it. And often there are restrictions there, you know, you only get that bursary every 3 years. But also the kinds of impact a professional development experience can have on teacher candidates who are just emerging and coming into the profession, as opposed to for teachers. And sometimes certain experiences seem to be really impactful for one group and very differently for the other. Right. And underlying, sorry, yeah.
I've been wondering, the idea you mentioned, les enseignants sont surchargés. That was a participant quote, I think. And I struggle with some of the ideas in the report, and that being one, similar to what you just said. Once people go, they want to go again. So the teacher, I acknowledge, teachers are busy, absolutely. And there is no end to that job. You could put everything into that job. But I think a busy teacher who makes a choice to do something for professional learning may find themselves in the situation where it provides them with more energy.
Yeah.
I don't know research about that, and I haven't asked questions about that, but it is floating in my head.
I think what comes into it too is that you're connecting to your community through professional development. And that's something we're seeing with the teacher candidates, the building of community during la formation initiale est un aspect super important. Building that community of practice, as you've said. So in that sense, it does give more energy then, and it really responds to that notion of isolation that we've really seen as well.
I guess, well, just to indicator to the group if anybody wants to react to the conversation so far, the exchange so far, or suggest or talk about what they're thinking about in terms of questions for research and so on. Now's the time. You can raise your hand. I see some people coming on camera. Excellent. So we can open up the floor to Roseanne.
Hi, everyone. I believe I've met a few of you. I am here at Western University, so I'm at the Faculty of Ed at Western. I'm also in the French department, so I'm joint, but this year I'm more so Faculty of Ed. So I just started last year, so part of my role is necessarily working on the teacher shortage, the recruitment retention. So I've been working, I'm mostly teaching, but I've been trying to start researching with some of this. And I'm just working on my SHRC proposal. And as I was just going through my references, and all of your names are on there, basically all over, which is funny. But to join in the conversation, we've had some success at Western this year. We have funding from Ministry of Colleges and Universities and from the Ontario Public School Boards Association up until June for a bunch of different initiatives. So we're really lucky to have that. So a few things that I was noting down that we're doing. We've done a lot of events for community building. I do find at a certain point I think people got event fatigue. So we did have some that were less attended, but I definitely feel that I was getting emails of people saying, oh, I couldn't make it, but my friend told me about it and I would like to come next time. So I definitely feel like one of the solutions is to keep going, not give up. If we did a few things, we're trying to get constant feedback as well, just sending out, short little Qualtrics surveys to see, and then people might say, well, it was a 3-hour event and I wish it were 2 hours, then I would have come, or if it were, just those little things to tweak. So we're going to try to implement that next year. But we've had an FSL lecture series with some different people coming in to speak. We had like a social event where we invited a bilingual comedian to come and do sort of a fun kind of event. We did a wellness challenge. Just little things where our goal was to sort of be sprinkling French around, so not necessarily forcing, but people are doing these things that are exciting and using a bit more French and just kind of creating a buzz around French in that way. And then our next event we're doing in February, like a little soirée conférence for all of our FSL teacher candidates. So we're having a few speakers come, but then they'll get like dinner, and we've put a lot of our marketing money into sort of fun items like swag. Like, oh, I have to show you our t-shirts that we got. I have one right here. I should have been wearing it. So we have on the back, it says Western Education. And then on the front, this is our little J'aime le français. So everyone has been getting those. We've been doing them as giveaways. We've been doing some of them. I think we're lucky that we got enough funding that we're able to do some things that might be seen as like frivolous if you have a less amount of funding and you need to fund your RAs. But they've really been important in some of the grassroots just building of this momentum. We're working with Thames Valley and London Catholic, which are our two local boards. So the FSL coordinators are on board with all of this. So, they're promoting everything. Students here at the faculty will see me wearing my t-shirt and they're like, how do I get one? And then I say, well, you come to the next event, and just little things like that, which are really creating a buzz. And then we also did a youth event for high school French students. So that was what the t-shirts were for. They came and so we did all the French teachers, and they were allowed to invite their students and they could come as well. And it was like formal, so they kind of dressed up a little bit. And then we had awards, so you could nominate your student for an award, which is like a certificate and stuff like that. And we got very good feedback too. And teachers were saying, students want to take French next year so they can come to the event next year. Little things like that. you know, as far as sustainability, obviously not all of that is going to be sustainable. We'll probably do maybe 2 or 3 events is what we're trying to do, like the youth event, the teacher candidate conference, and then we did also an FSL teacher appreciation event in May, which we had about 80 teachers come out to, which is pretty good, and we're trying to continue with that. Again, applying for funding now, so I'm not sure about sustainability, but I think even having some things is just building the momentum in that way. So yeah, so that's what I'm working at now. Obviously, as far as associations, like spreading the research, so I'll be presenting at OMLTA and at FUC and CF this year, so sort of spreading some of that I think helps as well, because people are hearing the strategies. And then talking about the importance of it with the students so that they're taking that into student teaching as well. I'm currently working on a SHRC, and from reading all of your research, what I'm going to propose to look into is the French, like undergraduate French program level, because I feel that there's a lot of great work being done with, you know, in service and pre-service. But it was probably in your report that I read, you know, there's also a certain level of expectation coming into the pre-service program. So I think for me as an FSL learner myself, I think there's sort of only so much that could have been done during my BEd program, if I wasn't already feeling confident with my French in a certain way, which I wasn't really, because I didn't have much opportunity to speak it in undergraduate. So we're going to be proposing to research undergraduate programs and sort of mapping of competencies. I'm still working on the proposal, but we're going to sort of try and map the competencies that are being taught in undergraduate courses to competencies that are being expected to be used when teaching. Not as a program evaluation, but just sort of, you know, room for filling of gaps or recommendations. You know, if someone comes in and they're asking, I'm interested in teaching, what courses should I take that they can recommend, a stream or something like that. So that's currently what I'm working on. But yeah, a lot of it was based on reading your reports and whatnot. So I'm pretty excited to.
Thank you for sharing that. That sounds exciting. I see Callie nodding. Do you have any reactions to, as a featured presenter, or anyone else in the virtual room? But I thought I'd open it up.
But congratulations.
I know.
Oh, thank you so much.
Congratulations for working with multiple systems, and yeah, it sounds exciting.
It reminded me of something that I had written down, because again, I'm a nerd and I write my reactions to the questions, even though I'm not the featured presenter. But my thought on this particular gap has always been, what's the metric for success, and what does that look like in FSL, slightly relative to other disciplines? But just listening to Roseanne, I mean, you're doing so many things for building community, and that seems to be to float to the top all the time when we're talking about FSL. I mean, Callie mentioned it, communities of practice, and that it is very significant in other domains and other disciplines. It just seems from the research that we did and even this discussion that if we're talking about time and access, one of the things we should prioritize for time is building those relationships, building the communities. And if we receive funding to do that as researchers, and we do that, then what questions are we asking in order to get at, to say this was successful? Like, that's kind of it's not the question of what we should be doing as much as how can we capture success? And when you have people in positions of power who are offering the funding, saying, for example, your recruitment number is increasing, that's a criteria for success. And other pieces might not be as well received in terms of, when I say pieces, criteria for success.
And when I was reading Gap 2, I was struck that when Wendy presented in December on language proficiency, and I'm reading Gap 2, and it's language proficiency.
Exactly.
It kept coming back. And so that just highlights for me, or re-highlights that needs to be a priority.
And so then I guess people would say, oh, well, then in order to know that language proficiency has been affected, the metrics for that can be anything from measurements of proficiency. As a researcher, you test the participants, you think about their confidence levels and if they've changed. And so it's those types of, I guess, contemplations that I'm trying to, I don't need to nail down one thing, but it's when there's such a buzz, as you mentioned, Roseanne, in terms of micro buzz at Western, and also a buzz around funding. It comes to a point where it's like, okay, the sustainability comes up. And so in order to be sustainable, you have to have some sort of demonstration of success. So what does that look like? Engagement at events, that would probably be something that as a researcher you'd want to capture.
I also wondered, as I was listening to you, Roseanne, what kind of feedback are you hearing as you're, as these events are happening?
All of the feedback that I've gotten has been positive. About everything. And that's been from board administrators saying just that there's a general buzz in their schools about it, people wanting to attend. The teachers have been coming up, especially after the appreciation event and the youth event, and they came up and were saying, just the point about being undervalued as, a French teacher. So something like that. Even if we had to do it on a smaller scale with less, door prizes and food, I think just them feeling valued and appreciated is really helping. And they're loving being able to connect with their coworkers and chat in French on a non-work basis. The students loved feeling appreciated. And then my teacher candidates here, as I mentioned in the chat, we started like a new course for French fluency, and they're loving it. We've done sort of informal interviews to get feedback, and it's been very, very positive, saying that they felt very unconfident at first, and just being in a safe space and getting to practice with people around their level is really helping. So it's been very positive. We've gotten, like our recruitment numbers for French have gone up. We've gotten good numbers for marketing. Those are the kind of things we try to include to look, more quantitative, but the feedback has been very positive so far. Again, it's hard though, because that's, it's qualitative feedback. Is that actually it's hard to show if that's actually going to make a difference as far as past this year.
Yeah, it is interesting though to hear and think about some of the things they're saying. It's about appreciation, it's about building confidence, and then those are the kinds of things that, as you're writing up your SHRC proposal, these are the kinds of things to keep in mind. Yeah.
I actually work with the Department of Education, so I'm in a very small province as well. So I have a very unique experience where I get to meet all of my teachers and I'm dealing specifically with core French. Our struggle, I think we're doing really well with retention the last couple of years. That's our school board is responsible for retention. We're doing really well with that. Recruitment. It's retention we're having the issue with. But we also struggle with pre-service teacher candidates doing their practicums in French classrooms, particularly the core French classrooms. And I know that has a lot to do with core French already has a bit of a reputation as kind of being a very difficult course to teach. So how can we encourage more teacher candidates? Because I know most of you have experience working with faculty of education. So how can we encourage more teacher candidates to attempt or to take a period of time to do a practicum in a core French classroom? Because I think if you can do core French, you can do immersion, not a problem.
I'm going to hand it over to our featured presenter.
She knows I'm biased. I love core French.
I know you do.
So do I.
So do I.
French. I love a challenge. I would agree it's a challenge. But in my context, our teacher candidates don't have a choice of where they go. So they can't choose to not have core French. They can't say we only want French immersion placement. So I don't know if that's the same in your context, Lana.
No.
But if a school board came to me and said that's where they want them, I'd be happy. I'd be thrilled. if Miles Turnbull he's back at UPI.
He is.
Hey,
Yeah.
Miles.
Yeah.
So maybe it's a matter of me reaching out to Miles as well and saying, hey, we have core French teachers who are willing to be cooperating teachers, would love to have service teachers in their classrooms. How can we work together to make that happen?
Yeah. Anytime I've ever had somebody from the community say, I would love to, why don't I ever get any students? I sort of describe to them the process and they're like, oh, okay. So I kind of have to advocate and it's like, oh, okay, right. But just in response to your question, I think it's worth also acknowledging the policies at hand in the community of the Faculty of Education. In my case, there's a lot of immersion that's mandated. So it's not uncommon for students to be put in immersion contexts and not core French, particularly at the primary junior level. And what I find in response to your question that resonates a lot with me, and I say it openly based on anecdotal evidence in the courses that I've taught, is there's like an interesting reaction to doing teacher ed in French immersion context practica and doing teacher ed in context in core French. Some are former core French students, love it. They're like, yes, this is great. I want to be a core French teacher. That's where I learned it. Others are scared of it.
Yeah.
So they're way more comfortable in immersion. Some openly say, I'm way more comfortable in immersion because I know it gets more support. I know it's more valued. So kind of in line with some of the conversations we're having. So I think your question is a valid one in terms of highlighting even more multidimensionality to the idea of teaching FSL. I mean, it's so different in different contexts within FSL.
Yeah, because there is a difference between teaching a subject in French and teaching the language.
Yes.
Right. So there's that too, that a lot of people are saying, well, I don't want to teach the language. I want to teach math. Well, can you really separate the two, especially in an immersion program?
Right. So,
yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, out west here, we actually have our biggest problem is finding core French classrooms, especially for the specialists. But what you said makes me think of some of the things we heard from teachers specifically talking about the ideas they came into the program with. There are a lot of misconceptions out there about what it's like to be a teacher in an FSL classroom. And so that some of this goes back to what Roseanne is saying, and what we're seeing in terms of some of the initiatives where we have high school students visiting university teacher education program classrooms, or encouraging undergrads to volunteer in an FSL classroom. So gaining these hands-on experiences with people in the field and with the field itself prior to, there are ideas like, because I didn't do French immersion, I didn't think I could ever be a French immersion teacher. Like, where does that even come from? So there are some really crazy ideas out there, but they're very real for people, and they are the obstacles. They keep people from moving forward and taking the risks. So those ideas about what it means that it's harder to be in an FSL in a core French classroom, I think, and I think that's where your what would you call them? We call them associate teachers. So the teachers in the schools taking the stagiaire, building a community with them through your teacher education program. And I think we have orientations and making those connections, because when the teacher candidates can make those personal connections, they're much more open to going there, right?
Yeah. It's interesting what you say about the misconceptions too, is because I am a core French student myself and was told by a university professor that I would never teach French.
I hope that gave you lots of motivation.
It did. I said, just watch me. So
and just to point out, Wendy was a core French. I was in a core French. I did not do immersion. Callie. So I think there are a lot of myths to
Yeah.
Wow, a teacher telling you that. That's
and it goes back to a lot. I think some of the, just to say maybe in terms of funding, and then I'll leave Callie to have a final word. The funding model related to recruitment and retention obviously responds to where there's gaps, and it's really an immersion, even though the majority of students are still in core French programs. So I just want to mention that that there's all these different systems interacting. That's why the sort of my comment about the measures of success comes, because we need to speak to all communities with our research. And I think that I've repeatedly received questions like that. Well, what's the one thing that's going to do it? And I'm like, okay, there might be one that floats to the top. That's kind of what I usually respond to, but if there was, we would have done it. Or maybe there's a question of why we haven't. That's a whole different other exchange topic. But Callie, I want to make sure that it is 1 o'clock. Do you have any final reflections? I know the time flew by, huh?
No, I just want to say thanks for the opportunity. And it kind of like we've been talking about with teachers, it also provided me, with a push myself to dig back into the report that I had read, to reflect upon it, I found motivation to look at some things I'm doing and make plans for the future. So I appreciated it, not only to be part of this community, but to provide me with some direction and lots of choices for future research, as always.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Thank you for your obviously inspiring comments and reflections and making us think and giving us an open invitation to share.